Hello and welcome to the second season of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, and I am coming to you from the Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in beautiful, freezing downtown Bennington. And I am very happy to be joined today by three of our representatives, Representative Mary Morrissey, Representative Tim Corcoran, and Representative Dave Durfee. We are going to be getting ourselves underway with this new session, talking about what's coming up in the legislative session, priorities for the legislators, priorities for Bennington, and priorities for the state of Vermont. But first of all, I just want to extend on this freezing day a warm welcome to the three of you.
Good morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jack.
And before we get into discussing the news of the day and the topics of the session, starting off In Session last year, whenever someone was on the show for the first time, I had asked a little bit about what got you into public life and what drew you to political service as the avenue for your community work. Slightly different introductory question for this second season, which is, who is someone who is a political inspiration to you? Could be somebody local, someone national, historical figure, living person. Just curious, who is that person where when you're sitting down to maybe write legislation or have a conversation that is difficult, who are you looking to for inspiration in the back of your mind as a political figure? And I'll start with you, Representative Durfee.
I think there could be lots of answers. The person who I'll name is a former legislator who was chairing the committee I sat on when I first was elected 7 years ago. That was Representative Bill Lippert, who had served for 25, maybe closer to 30 years. And well before I got to know him, had become a famous leading figure in the civil unions effort back at the turn of the century, and then gay marriage when that came along a little bit later. And by the time I got to the House, that was not ancient history, but he'd moved on and was chairing the healthcare committee that I sat on. And I, as I chair a committee today, often am, without consciously doing so, reminded of how he ran a committee. So in that sense, I think I have a lot of respect for him and think of him often.
Excellent. I love that it's a local connection. Representative Morrissey, who is somebody who you think of?
Well, that's a difficult question because I think I look at different folks that I have respected over the years, and that's a number of people that I have liked, how they've presented themselves. I mean, I can think of different legislators that I have served with of, all parties that not that parties should matter, but that I have truly respected because of their way of, as David said, like ran a committee or that. And, it is hard because in history, even looking back, I can say that I have appreciated, I think, different pieces of what individuals brought to discussions there. But to pick one person is very difficult for me, and I guess I will say it's a multitude of folks, whether in federal government, whether locally. I think of, often, quite honestly, Tim Corcoran's dad, Tim Sr. He motivated a lot of discussion in this town, and served in the legislature, was, our town manager, had an opinion on many different topics, and yet was very human and humble with what he stood for, and always thinking about the people that he was serving. And I always appreciated that. So I will leave it at that, even though I partially answered your question.
I think that's a lovely answer, and it's important because I think all of us, whatever work we're engaged in, probably do draw on a pantheon of people who come to mind. Representative Corcoran coming in last,
Yeah,
but certainly not
yeah,
least.
no, mine's very similar to Representative Morrissey's. There's been a lot of people along the way. When I got up to Montpelier 24 years ago, there was, a couple people. I know Representative Obahowski, who was a vice chair of transportation, and he was a former speaker. Um, you look and you take notes and you see how they operate and how they do things and how they get things done. And he was always a good person to look at to see, how things are done. And sometimes it's overwhelming, but when you have somebody, people of his ilk, it makes it a little bit easier, to navigate the system up there. And obviously my father, he was up there for 15, 16 years, and he was a great sounding board. um he is the one that never held back his opinion. If you had ask him, either be saying, "What the heck you thinking?" or "Why are you guys doing that?" And it was a good sounding board for sure to get that feedback. But like Mary, there's quite a few, but those are the two that just thinking off the top of my mind that come to mind.
That's fantastic. And as I said, I'm really very interested and kind of gratified to hear that there are people locally that you're drawing on. I think it's always kind of easy for many of us to think of large scale historical national figures in these kinds of conversations, but it's nice to hear the legacies of some of the local people who've had an impact, not only in the work that they did, but also in how they have now made a mark on new generations of legislators. Um, to that point, and the work that we're all interested in hearing more about, sort of what you're undertaking this session, I want to give you all a chance to let folks know where the emphasis is in the various committees on which you serve. So for anyone who's tuning into this show or is taking an interest in the sort of inner workings of the Vermont State Legislature for the first time, we have three folks with us who are all in the House of Representatives, and that the legislative session, a lot of that is focused on committee work, and each of you serve on a different committee. And so I just want to give you a chance to introduce the committee that you work on and where the focus of that committee seems like it's going to be during this legislative session. Representative Morrissey, I'll start with you since you are the ranking member on the Committee of Corrections and Institutions.
Well, I sit on the House Corrections and Institutions Committee, and I have been on that committee for now 8 years, and it is a money committee, such as appropriations is, as well as like Tim's committee of transportation. They're all finance committees, pretty much dealing with funding the different initiatives within and projects and other pieces of government. In institutions, we are a committee that has a 2-year budget, So last session, the beginning of this biennium, we put together our budget for the 2026 2027 sessions, or the 2-year process. Before that, we started doing that, I believe was it 4 or 6 years ago, and it actually, I think, is helpful because we have like a planning process that's laid out for 2 years, and right now we're in the middle of doing the budget adjustment for this 2-year budget, and especially with the governor giving his budget address this past Tuesday, we're delving right into, what we're looking at as increases in some areas or reallocations of funding to other projects. And, in institutions, that is, we deal with state buildings, that includes, water. We deal with dams and water projects, mostly projects that obviously have, a construction factor to it, and, multiple buildings and infrastructure across the state. In corrections, we deal with everything from our facilities across the state, but we also deal with like reentry and the need for when those who are incarcerated are coming out of one of our facilities, that hopefully we've got the resources for folks to come back into communities ready to re-engage in a community, hopefully in a positive way. So we try to have reentry plans in place, working with corrections, but it's a whole host of different issues that we're dealing with in both committees. But presently, I think our main focus for both of those entities in the state, as well as I'm sure you'll hear from Tim and David, that we're looking at budgets as budgets become a little bit more challenged because of, funding and some of the revenue focus of the state as well as the country. Some of those revenues are not ongoing, and we have to look at budgets, as we should, very, very carefully. So I will leave it at that.
That makes a lot of sense. Since you brought up the fact that Representative Corcoran is on another one of the money committees, as the vice chair of the transportation committee, give us a little bit of background on the committee, and then also where that focus for your work is right now and coming into this session. I know folks may have also seen recently that it was reported the Department of Transportation may be facing some layoffs in the near future. Maybe roll in a little bit of context on that as well, if you can.
Sure, no, absolutely. Yeah, transportation, we typically deal with two bills, our budget, which we're dealing with now, and then there's a DMV miscellaneous bill that starts in the Senate. So we basically swap bills when we pass them over. And your obvious things in, transportation bill are, your public transit, your aviation, your rail, paving, bridges, et cetera. So, that's what we deal with in your local, class two, town highway aid, we try to fund the locals to the best of our ability. Um, but as far as our budget and our main focus, as you alluded to, there's been some layoffs. This last July, there was a revenue downgrade of roughly 75 or 7.5 or $7.8 million downgrade. So tough decisions had to be unfortunately made to balance our budget because in the state of Vermont we can't pass an unbalanced budget, and so 31 positions at that time were ripped or let go, and some projects were moved around, and so that's how we dealt with that one. Fast forward to that was for the FY 26 budget. So fast forward to the FY 27 budget. The overall impact, money wise, was a $33 million impact because some of the monies that we funded the FY 26 budget were one-time money. So we knew there was going to be a hole that needed to be addressed. And so with the 33 million sort of hole, we had AOT just announced another 31. So a total of 62 people were unfortunately have been let go or will be let go because they're starting the process of the rift with the union. And when you get notifications, you have bumping rights depending on where you are, within the agency. So that, was obviously very upsetting for, our committee. Is, that's the last thing that we want to do is, let people go. But that's, unfortunately the situation that we, are that we're in. So that was, part of it. And then the other part was um to make that up, the agency, delayed projects were going to be, sort of crawling back or sort of on their schedule. Instead of maybe getting bill a bid in May or whatever, it might be the end of June, so it spills into the following um year. So there's some maneuverability on that. Another interesting thing is where they save money is, and it's sort of common, but if you ever go out to a restaurant to eat, when you pay your bill, you have the credit card fee. That's, typically 3% that is passed on the consumer. The state of Vermont always paid that. We encumbered that expense. That's going to be no longer. The DMV and the governor decided that they were going to sort of pass that on to the consumer. But there will be an option too. We haven't worked out the details, but there will be a billing mechanism online that is going to be free for users. But if you just want to use your credit card, there will be a processing fee on that. And that's, like I said, $1.9 million on that. So, but over the overall picture, and it just sort of give you a sort of a snapshot. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago, but our rate of growth for transportation is about 1.2% is, what our revenues are growing year after year. Unfortunately, the cost to build these things, pave them and everything else is at like 3 to 4%. So those two aren't meshing up. We have a structurally a funding problem. And, the governor has made quite clear that he will veto any bill that has any new taxes in there. So the gas tax, and I'm not saying that we were considering it, but the governor's made clear that there will not be a gas tax to address this shortfall. So it's going to be a tough year. One of the things that the governor did is that within transportation, we have three mechanisms for funding. You have your gas tax, you have your DMV fees, and then you have a purchase and use when you buy a car at 6%. Well, a third of that purchase and use goes to the ed fund, which is roughly $50 million. The governor wants to claw back all 50 of it, but over 5 years. So he's going to claw back 10 this year, and so on and so on. But doing that would say you're leaving a hole for the property tax. People to pay the property taxes because that's in the ed fund that's going to leave a hole. The governor says he's going to backfill it. We haven't really heard the details on that. So he's made that decision to transfer that money back. I know certain people in the building, probably particularly the Ways and Means Committee. I'm not sure if they're on board with that yet. But that's the process that we're in. That's our main focus is to get us back on track. Like I said, the governor doesn't want any new revenue sources, so it's tough decisions are going to have to be made of how we can continue forward and maintain our roads because people aren't shy of calling up and say I got a pothole here and a pothole there and what about my bridge? So I do think that there is some leeway, if you were going to talk about a revenue package that, if you were going to do, I'm not saying that we are, um, that people would be open-minded about that. I think they typically are. It's not really, political size in that manner. People want their, bridges done and roads paved. Those are our biggest that's our main focus right now. I'm sure we're gonna delve into other areas throughout, but within the first couple weeks, that's where we're just digesting that information and trying to understand the true impact for these cuts and what it has. What does it mean for Vermonters? So yeah.
And just as a very quick follow-up, since you did mention those specific revenue streams, the gas tax, the DMV fees, and the purchase and use taxes, can you just break down quickly approximate percentages, how much comes from each of those sources? Oh, he froze.
Let's see if it was like 59,
Sorry,
but
can
with the
you
downgrades, I
just
think
froze for a
it's.
second. Can you take that
Oh,
again
did
from the
I?
beginning? Yeah,
Oh, can you hear me now?
yeah, you're back now,
Yeah.
but just take it
Okay.
from the beginning. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have that sheet in front of me. I can just say that the purchase and use is 49 to 50 million. The other two, I will have to get back in a following show. I I just don't have that chart in front of me. But all of our revenues and that we bring in for our state dollars is north of 300 million. But I just don't know the total breakdown of the other two.
Sounds good. Thank goodness we have other shows.
Yeah.
And so coming to you, Representative Durfee, for the Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, which you now, as you alluded to earlier, you are the chair of. What's the work of that committee looking like in this session?
Well, we started off picking up where we left off last year. We had passed a bill that created a reserve fund or a grant program for farmers who were affected by uh, bad weather, uh, climate related rain. We had a couple of summers where there was torrential rain during July that wiped out, I mean, literally wiped out some farms in the state. Uh, we know that like locally, communities like Londonderry were severely impacted by those same storms, and some of that affected farmers down in the southern part of the state too. And then this past year, it's hard to remember now, but we had a big drought starting in July and extending well through the end of the growing season. And farmers were also, of course, impacted by that. Lost a lot of crops. Um, lot of feed for, hay for the winter silage that they normally would have had. Now they've got to go buy it. So first thing we did when we got back this session was approve that bill in the House and send it back to the Senate. So we're hoping that the Senate takes a good look at it and agrees. And then when we begin working on the budget that we've been talking about in a few weeks, that there'll be some money in the budget to actually populate that fund. So it's sort of a two-step process. First, setting up, creating the fund, and a mechanism for accepting applications and dispersing funds, deciding who would be eligible. But then we need to actually go ahead and create the fund. So that's now out of our hands, at least for the moment. And other things we've been working on also sort of date back to last spring. Just as we were wrapping up in May, there was a rather significant Vermont Supreme Court decision that upended really a longstanding common understanding of the authority of localities, towns and cities, municipalities, to regulate through zoning agriculture. So historically, towns didn't have any authority to do that. The state had sole authority to say, for example, you can put up a fence, you can put up a barn, you can operate your tractor early in the morning if you need to, because you've got to get the crops in, things like that. There was a decision, or there was a case in a community up north that tested that. And then surprisingly, the court said, well, we're interpreting the law a little bit differently than everyone else has been interpreting it for the last forever. I was going to say for the last 50 years, but it really goes back like indefinitely. So I think the common broad understanding is that we don't want to have farms put in the position of possibly having a community that doesn't want to have the farms right there suddenly not able to operate. I will say, thinking about the drought that we went through and all the bad weather that farmers have had to deal with, along with other sort of outside factors, economic factors, tariffs have been really challenging. Farmers are getting the lowest price for their milk that they've gotten in well over a decade. And of course, their costs have gone up. Inflation has hit farmers just like it's hit the transportation projects that Tim was talking about and everything else. So it's a tough time right now for Vermont's farmers. So we've been working on trying to find some compromise language that will allow the court to be satisfied, allow farmers to be satisfied, and then towns as well. Towns have an interest in this, and of course, when you suddenly say to the broader world that cities and towns do have some local control, they're not immediately going to want to give that up. Local control, we often hear about that recently in the context of school funding, but it goes beyond that, of course. So we're working on that. We've got a few other bills that are in the hopper. One that we don't actually have in our committee, but we may look at some point this year, has to do with the way farm workers are paid, or their eligibility for minimum wage. Right now, agricultural workers are not eligible for minimum wage. We've also been taking some testimony since we last spoke last year on the plight of immigrant farm workers. There are an estimated maybe close to 1,000, 900 or 1,000 undocumented or immigrant farm workers who are working without legal authorization in Vermont. mostly up north, mostly on dairy farms. It's true in every state. It's true in this part of, I mean, maybe right over the border in New York State, where there are some larger farms than we have right here in Bennington or Shaftesbury. Um, but those workers pay taxes. They are, pay their Social Security taxes. They have historically been sort of living in the shadows because people don't want to talk about them. But our economy, our dairy economy, our agricultural economy, which is obviously important part of our identity and our economy, really depends on them because it's hard to get other people to do that work, that hard work, 6 days a week. And we've taken some testimony on how the recent, immigration enforcement efforts have really turned their lives upside down. People in the past were maybe willing to go shopping, maybe willing to go to the doctor when they needed health care and send their kids to school. And over the past 12 months, that's changed. No surprise, right, to anybody who follows the news. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we just recommended for the budget adjustment some funding for a program called Bridges to Health that gives immigrant, not just farm workers, but anyone, information on how to access the healthcare that is available to them. It's often free healthcare. It might be for pregnant women, eligibility for funding that's in the state budget. So that's still pending. I don't know where we are, whether that is going to be next week or not, that we take a look at the budget adjustment, but we're getting close on that. So yeah, those are some of the things we've been working on so far.
And on that theme, just as a follow-up, you are also working with the Agricultural Worker Labor and Employment Laws Study Committee. Can you talk a little bit about that study committee's work and how it connects to some of this particular testimony that the committee is hearing and what the outcomes of that study committee might be?
Yeah, so that study committee was in the fall of 2024, actually, and met and produced a set of recommendations, limited recommendations that uh, were called for in a bill that we passed 2 years ago. Um, the and as I started to say, farm workers don't have eligibility for minimum wage or overtime. That's true of all farm workers. It's not specific to any industry, any sector of the farm economy. Anybody who works on a farm in Vermont is not eligible for minimum wage, not eligible for overtime, and also not able to form a union, uh, which is unique to agricultural. Everyone else in Vermont, does have that right, either in federal law or state law. Uh, and interestingly, the House and Senate have both approved uh, an amendment to the Constitution, Vermont Constitution, that goes before voters in November, that in plain language just says all Vermonters will have the right to be part of the union, no matter what work you do. Assuming that gets passed in November, then their farm workers would constitutionally have the right to organize. So we in the legislature are aware that will upend things a little bit, and we'll have a state law that basically contradicts what's in the state constitution. And it will probably be in everyone's best interest, again, assuming that happens, to have some language in law that is not inconsistent with our state constitution, but also says, here's how this would happen. There's lots of statute that talks about how in other parts of the economy, other sectors, how unions operate. And we may not want to just default to one of those because things in sector by sector can be different. The public sector versus the private sector. This session, I don't think we're going to be getting to that, but it's quite likely that again, assuming that the amendment passes, that next year, come next January, we'll be looking at a bill that sets up a framework for that.
Excellent. I appreciate that additional context and also that note for folks to make sure to check their ballots for some of these. It's not just voting for elected officials. There's going to be some other really important stuff on ballots in the fall for people to consider. So we've gotten into a little bit of the very important sort of nitty-gritty committee work that's going to be going on, which is a lot for people to understand and to keep track of. But I also want to sort of, at this early stage in the session, take the broader temperature. So for me, as somebody who's not obviously up in Montpelier all the time, the big things that seem to be popping are obviously education reform and the follow-up from Act 73 being passed in the last session, and the outcome of the committee work, the study committee that worked and produced its very extensive report over the summer. Obviously, every single session there's budget negotiations, but this year it seems like that, similar to last year, will be an even more intense process than usual for a number of reasons. The governor has put forward his $9.4 billion proposed budget, which is up from $9.01 billion last year, but not a particularly significant increase compared to some of the past budgets, which he's been very clear in his statements about why that is, and which he has announced will include $105 million to buy down property taxes. And then this sort of pressure and uncertainty from the federal side in terms of what funding that has normally flowed to Vermont that may or may not, based on how federal projects and programs are changing over time, but also some of the news that has been coming out about a list of 14 states, Vermont included, that are being targeted for additional federal review of their federal programs and of the federal money that comes in to support some of the work that goes on in the state. And then coming on sort of an ongoing basis, the larger scale changes to massive industries like healthcare. Um, I kind of want to check in with the three of you as people who are in the building, talking with your colleagues, undertaking not only this committee work, but looking at what are the themes of the session going to be. Does that outsiders' understanding match with what the conversations in the building are like? Are there other things that are coming up, or is there texture to that conversation and those issues that it would be important for those of us who are interested to understand about how this session is going to play out? And I'll start with you, Representative Corcoran.
Yeah, no, Jack, you hit the nail on the head. Those are, the major themes, but with anything, they're always, we have, I probably should know the top of numbers, 12 or 13 different committees that are working on different things that don't, their jurisdiction isn't in healthcare or, education, things of that nature. So they're doing their own things which may or may not garner attention, but the education, no doubt is going to be a tough one. The governor during his speech, and I've been up there for a little bit, and I don't think I've ever recalled the governor basically threatening a veto. He says, "I will not sign a budget or a bill that doesn't have basically what I want at the end of the day." So that's so he put that out there, so that's our sort of the mindset of of where we are, and can we get there at the end of the day? I'm not quite sure. It's going to be tough. We have a lot of members obviously from the rural areas, and they're going to have feel the impact if we do go from the 109 school districts or 119 school districts down to 10, 15, or whatever the number is, 20. They could have an impact on their schools and supervisory units from 54 going down to, the next amount. So, I mean, it's going to be quite a process. We need to have a bill that we can get out of the legislature, and then we're going to need a bill that the governor's willing to sign. And, we're not off to a great start. There was a committee, obviously assigned over the summer to sort of come up with 3 maps to sort of start that process. I'm not saying that they didn't do their work. They heard from Vermonters. They heard from over 5,000 people. They took that information and they gave us a report back. Obviously, it wasn't to the governor's liking, but that's in the eye of the beholder. That's neither here nor there. It is what it is. So, the committees right now of jurisdiction are seeing if we can come up with a map. So that's our starting point on that. But even if there isn't a map, I still think there's things that can be accomplished, specifically with the foundation formula. Setting an amount of, all right, this is what the districts get. This is what you have to work within. So I think that's a good starting point. And there's some other bills out there too. The Senator Pro Temp, Senator Bruce from Burlington has a cap and freeze bill. Haven't really delved into that too much, but the governor sort of pointed that out during his address, saying that we should implement that while we're trying to figure out, the rest of the bill. So, those are, like I said, those are things that I know that our speaker, Jill Kowinski, is honed on and is going to make a good faith attempt of trying to get to the end game. And this isn't really political. It's trying to bring all parties together, and it really can't be political because, like you said, you got representatives from all over the state and represent different areas. So it's we're going to put our best foot forward and and see where it comes out. And so yeah, no, I think you're right. That is a major issue. And obviously healthcare is busy trying to come up with ways to reduce prescription drugs. I think they have some ideas. Probably not going to be groundbreaking, but I think there's going to be an attempt to try to lower some costs there. So yeah, no, I'll leave it at that. Those are two of the major things that I think are going to come out. And the other committees, like I said, they'll sprinkle in other bills. So yeah.
Staying on that theme of education and the consistency and forcefulness of the governor's messaging about this and his own commitment to seeing certain types of reforms put in place, I'm interested in your take, Representative Corcoran, that you have quite a bit of institutional memory and that this does feel a little bit different than messages you've heard from governors in the past. Representative Morrissey, is that also sort of your sense and your feeling hearing the governor's address this year and thinking about how you and the other legislators will have to approach putting together a budget package, and particularly some of these education reform packages?
I would say yes, it was a different tone that the governor had in his initial address to us a couple of weeks ago, but then also, obviously with his budget speech. The education piece is a somewhat complicated area to look at. I started in the legislature when Act 60 was passed, and it was a very complicated bill. I remember going back to town meeting week that year, and that was 30 years ago. And they said, explain what had been done up to that point in the legislature in regards to moving Act 60 along. And it was so complicated that I believe even some of the folks in the Ledge Council trying to write this legislation based upon all the factors that people were wanting included in the education, the Act 60 education bill, just made it so very difficult to see how communities, taxpayers were going to be able to fund this and do and not only fund it. I think sometimes it has been lost in the discussion, the education and the quality education for our students. You know, we can keep looking at the money, and yes, everything costs something to do, but we would sometimes be losing sight of what we were doing. And, you know, I did not vote for Act 60 when it first came out because I did feel it was complicated, to the point of you would just continue to, it would almost be this bottomless pit of funding and maybe not getting the results. And unfortunately, what has happened is over the years, different initiatives have been made. You know, Act 46 was a few years ago. You know, they were trying to say that would help cut the costs and merging schools, and ultimately it didn't do that. And it actually made it very difficult for some districts, because within those districts they had to close a school or that, and there's some bad feelings, you know, across the state in certain areas of schools that had to close and others that were allowed to stay open. We've got to look at education very carefully and thoughtful in what we're doing going forward. We have, you know, the budget for education is, I believe it's, and I'm saying this off the top, I think it's over $2 billion or $2.5 billion, I believe. And over the years since Act 60, we've seen a significant drop in the student population within our schools. The cost to educate our children has gone through the roof. Our taxpayers, and that's probably one of the number one issues I hear, and people talk about, you know, taxes across the board, but it is the property tax that just is really concerning to folks. And yet, with all the money, and we are one of the top, I believe we're in the top 3, my understanding is that in our pupil, our spending per pupil in the country. And yet we have a number of schools not making the grade, shall we say, that are at one point the language that was used a couple of years ago as they were failing. That's not a good mix when you're putting all of this money into it and not getting the results for our children in the state. So this does have to be looked at extremely careful. It is very complex. It's not a one issue fix, because again, I know they've talked about consolidating from the 100 and I think 90 districts. You know, at first the governor was saying down to 5. And I, right out of the gate, said I could not look to I could not support that in any way, shape, or form. We need to look at this with consolidation and actually looking possibly at other states that may be our size. How are they doing it? Pick, pulling pieces from different education systems around the country that we're trying to look at, what is being beneficial for other areas, and yet having our own policy going forward. It is complicated, but we've got to get our arms around what we're doing here. And it's not a one item fix. It's a number of pieces within education. And yet, most importantly, in the discussion, we've got to support our children's education. We've got to support the teachers and the resources they need to educate. But we've got to find a balance here in what we're doing that is productive and beneficial going forward. But as you've talked about, other issues, a very key and important, I think equally as important is education. As education is the healthcare complexities and concerns with the cost of healthcare, and actually the concern of we have a huge issue in the state with even having primary care, and yet the costs keep going up, and of course along with that is the mental health issues within our state, and the different factors that plays into, and also housing and other issues like that are important, and public safety. But probably right now, my two key issues are education and healthcare.
And to that point about finding the balance between the outcomes that are desired and the potential financial strains, that did seem to be Representative Corcoran. You mentioned the work of the committee that resulted in a report. The committee initially tasked with drawing new maps basically said, we don't think that's the right thing to do, and instead recommended things like regionalization of certain services rather than redrawing districts, again, with this idea of what would actually be cost effective while also preserving outcomes for students. Obviously, that's just a starting point for more conversation. But coming over to you, Representative Durfee, I guess I'm curious, hearing that from both Representatives Corcoran and Morrissey, that the governor is striking a noticeably different tone. How does that coming from the governor's office then influence the nature of the conversations and work that legislators are doing? Does that set a different tone for the session? And what does that look like?
I think that in terms of education reform, uh, it continues a tone maybe just using a slightly different tactic, but it's not, to me, it didn't come across as, oh, this is an abrupt shift in the governor's approach to dealing with this issue. He had said, yeah, certainly something a year ago that made it clear that this was a priority of his, and he was able to point to the uh, the results of the election, the previous election, where he had personally campaigned to elect legislators who would support broad education reform, and it's successfully done so. So I think that the question is, and as I think Tim said, this is not a partisan issue. It's not, in the sense that it's not, well, Republicans feel this way and Democrats feel that way. But the governor, as the leader of the Republican Party, I think has additional ability to say to members of his party, um, please understand that you need to support me on this, regardless of how it might affect your district. And there are lots of small rural districts across the state that are under the governor's proposal looking at dramatically changing the way education is delivered in their communities, uh, possibly closing schools, possibly less funding under the new approach to funding, what we've been calling the foundation formula, which is I think maybe not the best term for it, but it basically would put restraints on future growth of spending. And to the extent that we're talking, of course, about educational quality here and trying to make that more equitable across the state, that how we pay for it and how much we pay for it is really where the conversation came from in the first place. So I think this will be a political question in the sense that we're all elected by our own communities, and uh, where those communities can look at a proposal and say, yeah, I like this, then it'll be easy for a representative to vote in favor of it. If they don't like it, it may depend on how much pressure they're getting from the leader of their party, which in one case is the governor, and the other case is either the pro tem in the Senate or the speaker. And I know all three of those leaders, for possibly for different reasons, want to see something happen. And they're pushing against strong forces, really. I mean, this has been Act 60. I was not, unlike Representative Morrissey, in the legislature, and of course Tim was there shortly thereafter. That's it's been 25, 30, close to 30 years now, and it was not perfect, but it's hard to change because people don't want to give up their local control. I will say, though, I think that for Bennington, Shaftesbury, other towns in the area, Act 60 has been a very good thing. That it has brought state funding to our education system that would never have come otherwise, and that millions and millions of dollars over the years. I look carefully at tax bills just because that's something that I do, not just in Shaftesbury. The tax rate is not the same thing as the tax bill. And our tax rates are based on property, and most of us pay based on income, actually. But Bennington's tax rate on residential homestead property is basically the same as it was a decade ago. That's for complicated. It's a complicated formula, and it shouldn't be that way because we've spent a lot more. We're spending a lot more on education locally. But that's the way the state education system is built, so I think we sort of, when we hear, Vermont spends the second or third or fourth most per pupil than any state in the country. That's not us. We're not doing that here in Bennington. Let's be clear about that. First of all, we're near the bottom of Vermont, so we're much more in line with the country as a whole, and maybe below average. And when we hear our property taxes are going through the roof, we hear that from state media. It's actually not true here in Bennington and Shaftesbury, or at least historically, it hasn't been true. And next year, maybe a different story, because things will catch up eventually.
Yeah, and I think the other component of this that to kick off this season of In Session, I did sit down with Senator Bongartz to really dig into education, since it will be such a theme of the session. And one of the points that he was making as well is that different districts and their own budgets may look different year over year than what we hear about in terms of the overall state education spending. So, for example, the new SVSU district, covering most of, but not all of Bennington County, their budget change is about 1%. year over year. So again, we'll talk a lot more about this as a statewide issue, and we'll also really dig into what it means here in Bennington, what these proposed transformations might mean, and where we are now. I want to thank all three of you for your time this morning, and I look forward to having many more of these conversations. Thank you all.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you, Jack.